The sound the paper made was small. That was what stayed with me first. Not loud enough for a scene, not sharp enough to stop the boarding announcement overhead. Just a dry little rip in Rochelle's hands, then another one across the middle. Like my place on that trip could be reduced to scraps with no more effort than opening junk mail. She held the torn pieces between two fingers and smiled at me so brightly it almost looked polite. Then she leaned in just enough for her perfume to reach me and said, "This trip is for family. You don't fit in." A couple of the younger ones laughed the way people laugh when cruelty surprises them, but not enough to make them reject it. My passport was still in my left hand. My carry-on stood upright by my ankle. I had paid for all 5 plane tickets, the resort, the airport transfers, the little boat excursion my granddaughter begged for after seeing a brochure online, and the matching vacation sets she wanted so we could look nice in pictures. I remember that because there I stood, dressed neatly for a trip I financed, being told I did not belong on it. What hurt me was not Rochelle. Women like her always believe charm is the same thing as character. What hurt me was my son. Marcellus did not frown. He did not step in. He did not even pretend confusion. He gave one small nod, almost impatient, the kind a man gives when he wants an ugly thing to keep moving without having to speak it himself. That nod reached somewhere deeper than the torn ticket ever could. It told me this had been discussed, planned, approved. A gate agent looked up from the scanner, saw enough, then looked back down. A man in a blue windbreaker turned his head and then turned it right back. Public humiliation has a strange sound to it. Not noise, silence. The kind that lets you know people have seen and chosen not to interrupt. Rochelle dropped the torn pieces into my hand. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said, still wearing that smile. I looked at the scraps in my palm, then at my son's face. "I see," I said. My voice did not shake. That seemed to disappoint her more than tears would have. I bent, took hold of my carry-on, and turned around. I had spent 31 years teaching children how to steady their hands before writing something important. Those same hands got me all the way back through that terminal without trembling once. Past the food court, past the bright gift shop by security, down the escalator, through the parking deck that smelled like hot concrete and old oil. I did not run. I did not call anybody. By the time I reached my car, the wound had already changed shape. I am Odette Vickers. I am 64 years old, a retired school teacher, a widow, and until that morning I would have told you I knew the limits of what humiliation could do to a person. I was wrong. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the torn ticket still folded in my hand. I thought about my husband. I thought about the house waiting for me. I thought about how many things I had paid for in that family without ever once sending an invoice for the disrespect. If you're here with me, tell me where you're watching from. I did not cry. That is what people always imagine when they hear a story like this. They imagine a woman collapsing in a parking lot, mascara running, faith rattled, voice breaking apart in her chest. But the crying part was already over before I made it to the elevator. What settled over me in that car was colder than hurt and cleaner than rage. I sat there for 11 minutes with my hands folded in my lap. Not because I was broken, because I was deciding. By the time I turned that car key and drove home from the airport, I already knew the wound was bigger than a torn ticket. Paper tears quickly. What had been happening inside my house had taken years. I bought that house in my 40s, before retirement, before widowhood, before anybody started speaking around me like I was furniture with a pension attached. I bought it in my own name after years of teaching school during the day, taking summer classes when they were offered, and stretching every dollar until it learned manners. The mortgage was mine. The deed was mine. When the roof needed replacing, I paid for it. When the plumbing backed up the year before my husband got sick, I paid for that too. Every wall in that house had heard my labor before it ever heard their opinions. Marcellus grew up there. I packed his lunches at that kitchen counter. I pressed his shirts in the laundry room off the hall. I sat up nights with him when fevers came through in waves, and mornings when school projects were due and somehow still half finished. I was the kind of mother who made things work before there was evidence they could. That does something to a woman. It teaches her how to carry more than she should and call it love. When he married Rochelle and money got tight, he came to me carefully. He did not ask like a spoiled son. He asked like a tired man trying not to look defeated. "Just for a little while, Ma," he said, "till we get settled." I remember looking at him for a second longer than he realized. Because even then, there was something in his voice that sounded like he had already practiced that sentence somewhere else, before bringing it to me. Still, I let them move in. That is what family means to women like me. Not paperwork, not leverage, shelter. I gave him a key the way mothers do things, emotionally, not legally. That was my mistake. I treated trust like it protected itself. At first, Rochelle was easy to welcome, sweet in church, helpful when company came over. The kind of woman who carried a casserole dish with both hands and called everybody Mama, in a voice soft enough to sound respectful. She complimented my curtains, brought me tea, told people I had such a beautiful spirit. I have lived long enough to know charm is often just ambition dressed for daylight. But she moved so carefully in the beginning, I let myself believe she meant well. The first time something in me tightened, it was small enough to excuse. We were in the kitchen one evening, and I had just finished cooking. I set Marcellus's plate down the way I always had. Rice on the left, vegetables on the right, meat in the center. Habit, care, years. Rochelle stepped in, smiling. "Oh, Mama, let me fix it," she said lightly, already reaching. She turned the plate slightly, adjusted the portions, added something from the stove I hadn't planned to include. Not wrong. Just corrected. Marcellus laughed under his breath. "Yeah, she likes it this way now." Now. I remember looking at him, waiting for him to notice what had just happened. Not the food. The moment. He didn't. He picked up his fork and started eating. That was the first time I understood something I did not yet name. Not disrespect. Permission. The changes after that started small enough to hide inside themselves. A lamp moved from the den to the guest room. My husband's old magazines cleared off the side table without anybody asking. A framed school photo of Marcellus at 12 disappeared from the hallway and was replaced with one of those glossy couple portraits where everybody looks expensive and vaguely unhappy. Then my kitchen got reorganized. Spices shifted. Pots moved. The good serving bowl my sister gave me one Christmas was suddenly on a higher shelf, as if my own reach needed editing inside my own home. One afternoon, I opened a drawer and stood there longer than necessary, not because I couldn't find what I needed, but because I understood something quietly. I was being rearranged. Nothing she did was dramatic enough on its own. That was the trick of it. By the time a thing can be named clearly, it has usually been happening for some time. Then one Sunday afternoon, she brought up power of attorney, not harshly, not foolishly. She was slicing pound cake at the counter when she said, "Mama, you should think about putting something in place just in case anything happens." Marcellus stood nearby, nodding like the thought had arrived naturally. But I watched him, not his face, his timing. He did not hesitate. That told me enough. I remember smiling at her and saying I would think about it. I remember how pleased she looked with herself. I also remember sitting in a lawyer's office the very next morning because instinct is sometimes just experience arriving early enough to save you. That night, after I got home, I stood in my bedroom doorway looking at the side of the bed my husband used to sleep on. There are some memories that never come to you whole, just pieces. A late call, a strained voice, a sentence cut short in the dark. One unfinished night I had never stopped replaying. And standing there, I realized something I had been avoiding. This did not begin at the airport. The airport was just the first time they stopped hiding it. My husband used to say the people who smile the widest are usually the ones measuring the room. I should have listened sooner. But I was listening now. The night my husband had his stroke did not arrive with thunder. That is one of the details people get wrong when they imagine tragedy later. They think the air must have changed. They think the room must have warned somebody. But some of the worst nights in a woman's life begin under ordinary light. He was at Marcellus's house that evening, back when I still thought of it that way, though the roof over them was mine. I had a church committee obligation across town, and almost did not go. I remember standing in my bedroom fastening one earring and thinking I was tired enough to call and excuse myself. My husband told me to go on, said he would be fine watching television with our son for a few hours. I left because married life teaches you to trust the easy moments. You think there will be another one waiting when you get back. The call came near midnight. Not early. Not when the first sign appeared. Not when confusion set in. Not when his words began to drag. Near midnight, Marcellus's voice was too controlled. Rochelle was making noise in the background, not crying exactly, but speaking in that thin, sharp tone people use when they want panic to sound organized. By the time I reached the hospital, the ambulance had already done what ambulances do. Machines were speaking. Doors were opening and shutting. Everybody was using calm voices around me, which is how you know the truth is bad. Nobody ever handed me a sentence clean enough to live inside. That was the cruelty of it. The doctors used careful language. They said timing matters with strokes. They said earlier, intervention can affect outcomes. They said there had been a delay between symptom recognition and emergency response, though pinning down exactly when symptoms became unmistakable was difficult after the fact. Professional words, responsible words, words that protect hospitals and haunt wives. The number that stayed with me was 47 minutes, not the time from stroke to death, not proof of anything simple, just the disputed stretch between when something was clearly wrong and when help was finally called. 47 minutes is not dramatic on paper. But once you have loved someone long enough, you can hear a whole failure inside a number like that. The next morning, I watched my son standing beside his father's bed. He did not look cruel. That would have been easier. He looked like a man already arranging himself around an explanation. Before I asked anything, he was saying things like, "It happened fast," and "We didn't realize at first," and he seemed tired earlier. He kept offering answers to a question I had not yet put into words. That mattered to me. It still does. My husband lived 8 more months. I fed him. I bathed him. I learned how to lift him without making him feel ashamed. I read scripture when he could no longer turn pages. I talked to him even when his eyes did more answering than his mouth. Rochelle visited when it suited her schedule. Marcellus came often enough to call himself present and not often enough to call himself burdened. I never accused anyone. I wrote things down. One journal entry said, March 14th. Doctor said, timing is everything with these events. Marcellus would not meet my eyes when I asked what time the slurring started. Rochelle answered for him. I do not know what is worse, the delay or the way the room bent around it afterward. I wrote, because grief needed somewhere to go that would not talk back. At the funeral, people kept saying my husband looked peaceful. I stood there greeting mourners while Rochelle rested one hand on Marcellus's arm every time a camera turned toward them, composed as Sunday morning. In every photograph from that day, she appears ready. What I remember is not readiness. It is record. Grief is loud when it first arrives. But truth, when it starts building, does its work in silence. By then, I had learned to be very, very quiet. By the time I got home from the airport, the house was quiet in that particular way only a borrowed peace can be quiet. No television murmuring from the den, no footsteps overhead, no Rochelle moving through rooms like everything inside them had already introduced itself to her properly. Just stillness, the kind that lets a woman hear what she has been excusing. I set my purse on the kitchen counter, took off my shoes, and filled the kettle. My hands moved without hurry. That surprised me a little. I had just been humiliated in public by a woman sleeping under my roof and endorsed by the son I raised with my own body and prayers. But my hands were steady. I stood there listening to the water begin its low, restless sound and understood something simple. Shock is loud at first, then it clears. What comes after is usually more useful. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table where I had corrected spelling tests, signed report cards, wrapped Christmas money in white envelopes, and once helped Marcellus glue dry pasta onto poster board for a school project he had remembered at the last possible minute. I laid my house keys beside my cup and looked around the room slowly. Nothing had changed that afternoon. That was the point. The room had been shifting for years. I had just still been looking at it with mother eyes. I got up and took a fresh notebook from the drawer by the phone. It was one of the plain black and white marbled ones I used to keep in stacks when I was still teaching. I opened it to the first page and wrote one word across the top in careful print. Then I closed it and left it there on the table while I walked through the house. Not as a woman wandering through memory. As a woman taking inventory. In the hallway closet, the extra linens had been rearranged months ago so that the sets I bought were pushed to the back, and the newer ones Rochelle preferred sat folded in easy reach. In the den, my husband's chair had been reupholstered in a pale fabric he would have hated. Too slick, too decorative, no warmth to it. She had called it an update. I had called it nothing. In the guest room closet, I found 2 framed school photographs of Marcellus tucked behind old wrapping paper, replaced downstairs by larger, shinier pictures from trips and dinners I had often paid for and barely appeared in. In my own kitchen, the drawers no longer opened into my habits. Utensils had been moved, towels relocated. The tea strainers I used most were no longer near the stove, but in a lower drawer that made me bend each time as if the room itself wanted to remind me I was no longer expected at full height. That was when I understood the shape of what had been done. Disrespect rarely arrives like thunder. It arrives like replacement. I went back to the kitchen, picked up the phone, and called my estate attorney's office. The after-hours message clicked on. I waited for the tone and said, "This is Odette Vickers. I need the earliest appointment available tomorrow morning. It's urgent." My voice sounded calm enough to belong to somebody ordering stationery. I hung up, washed my cup, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet exactly where it belonged. Then I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the darkened doorway. I expected grief to come for me then, or anger, or at least the shakiness that follows humiliation once nobody is watching. It did not. What came instead was certainty. I went to bed earlier than usual and slept all the way through the night for the first time in years. No waking at 2 a.m. with my thoughts circling old injuries. No turning over conversations in my head until sunrise. Uncertainty exhausts a woman. Decision does not. Before I turned off the light, I looked at the page again. I had written one word, begin, and I meant it. The next morning, I was dressed and out of the house before 8. That, more than anything, told me I was finished grieving the airport and ready to work. Grief drags its feet. Work does not. I wore a navy blouse, low heels, and the good watch my husband gave me on our 25th anniversary. Not because I needed courage from an object, because I wanted to be reminded that I had built a life before Marcellus and Rochelle ever started trying to rearrange it. My estate attorney's office sat on the second floor of a brick building downtown above a dentist and across from a bank that had been there longer than some marriages. I had first met him years earlier when I updated our will after my husband's second hospital stay. He was younger than I preferred attorneys to be, but careful, which matters more. He brought in coffee, legal pads, and the kind of face professionals wear when they know the story they are about to hear will require precision. I explained the living arrangement plainly. The house was mine. Sole deed. Sole title. Marcellus and Rochelle had moved in by permission during a rough financial stretch. There had been no deed transfer, no ownership change, no lease granting them rights beyond what I allowed. I had not signed power of attorney. I had not added anybody to the property. I had not confused kindness with paperwork, even if I had confused it with safety. He nodded and took notes. Then he said what I needed somebody outside the family to say, "Mrs. Vickers, there is no legal confusion here unless you create one by hesitating." That sentence settled something in me. He walked me through my options in language that did not require a translator. Update the will immediately. Tighten beneficiary designations. Put all future property communication in writing. Document dates, incidents, and financial concerns. Do not argue in person. Do not explain yourself casually by text. And whatever steps I intended to take regarding the house, take them with a paper trail before they returned from their trip. When I left his office, I did not feel angry. I felt organized. That afternoon, I met the forensic accountant in a small office suite near the church district, the kind of place with beige walls, humming vents, and a front desk that smelled faintly of lemon polish. Her name was Denise Porter. She was in her 60s too, maybe a little older, with silver at her temples and eyes that had plainly watched families lie over money before. I knew her from church, though not well. She sang alto, never loudly, and once told a women's breakfast room that she got into financial review work after watching her own mother get picked apart by relatives who kept calling theft help. That was enough for me. We sat across from each other at a conference table while I opened my handbag, then another tote, then the folder I had packed before leaving home. Statements, receipts, pension summaries, utility changes, travel expenses, notes I had made when spending shifted inside the house. Denise did not interrupt the order in which I laid things down. She just watched, occasionally asking for a date or repeating a number back to me. For the first time since the gate, I felt like myself again. Not because I was winning anything yet, because I was being exact. I have spent most of my life reading what people miss. When a child is pretending not to know the answer, when a parent signs a form without understanding it, when trouble begins in the room before it names itself. All I was doing now was redirecting that same attention toward my own life. By the end of the second day, I left with a banker's box of photocopies, a list of follow-ups, and a timeline clipped neatly on top. I carried it out to my car with both hands like it mattered, because it did. They had gone to lie under umbrellas I paid for. I had gone to sit under fluorescent lights with women who knew how to read damage. We had very different ideas about what a vacation was. Denise called me on the third day just after 10 in the morning, while I was standing in my kitchen rinsing out a teacup I had not actually wanted. Her voice was calm, which I had already learned was not the same thing as reassuring. "Do you have a minute to sit down?" she asked. That was how people prepared you for things they did not intend to soften. I dried my hands, pulled out a chair, and sat. "The pattern is the problem," she said. "Not one transaction. The pattern." That sentence stayed with me because it fit more than money. I did not speak. I let her continue. She walked me through the findings slowly. Repeated convenience withdrawals. Transfers marked as household reimbursements that did not line up cleanly with actual household bills. Small amounts moving often enough to avoid attention and large enough, over time, to become their own kind of disrespect. I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. There were account access habits that suggested Rochelle had been doing more than helping Marcellus organize things. Denise was careful not to overstate what she could not yet prove, but I heard the weight in what she chose to repeat. "She had access?" I asked quietly. "More than I would be comfortable with," Denise said. That was the closest thing to a warning she needed to give. The daughter-in-law had reach. Too much of it. Then she mentioned Marcellus's savings. That part tightened something low in my chest, in a way I did not expect. "There are irregularities there too," she said. "Not spectacular losses, not the kind of numbers that make a banker call after hours, but enough to suggest he had not been steering his own money as fully as a grown man ought to. Enough to suggest he was either being managed more than he admitted, or surrendering control because surrender was easier than conflict." I leaned back slightly in the chair and stared at the far wall of my kitchen. For a moment, I did not see the wall. I saw that plate at the table. The way Rochelle had adjusted it. The way he had laughed. The way he had accepted correction like it was comfort. "I see," I said. But what I meant was, I understand now how far this has gone. Denise chose her words the way a surgeon chooses where to cut. "I'm not telling you this is the cleanest prosecutable version of financial elder abuse," she said. "I am telling you there are enough warning signs that if you wait, the picture could get uglier fast. Borderline cases become full cases every day because older women keep hoping behavior will correct itself." That line landed harder than the numbers, because hope had cost me before, and I had been hoping longer than I admitted. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, the phone still in my hand, the kitchen too quiet around me. Then I stood, not quickly, decisively. I went to the linen closet in the hall, knelt down, and reached behind the winter blankets for the old shoebox I had kept there for 2 years. Not days, not weeks. 2 years. Brown cardboard, lid slightly bent at one corner, the kind of box nobody notices because it looks like it belongs to nothing important. Rochelle had once laughed and told somebody at church I was old school enough to keep half my life in boxes. She meant it as a joke. She was not wrong. She was just careless about what kinds of lives women like me actually keep. Inside were not coupons. Inside were copies, bank statements with dates circled in blue ink, notes in the margins, printouts of transfers that had felt too neat at the time, utility records, pension deposit summaries, grocery totals from months when the spending in my house somehow rose, while my comfort in it declined. I had not started collecting them because I was suspicious. I had started because something in me had grown unsettled. There is a difference. Nothing dramatic. That was the danger. A woman can miss a single blow. It is harder to miss a pattern once you lay it flat. I spread everything across the bed and started matching the dates Denise had mentioned to the copies I already had. Not searching, confirming. That was the difference now. One transfer stopped me. It was labeled as part of the travel deposit. I stared at the amount longer than I care to admit. It was higher than what had ever been said aloud in my presence. Not by a little either. Enough to tell me the trip had not simply been planned with my generosity in mind. It had been padded, expanded, quietly fed by money that moved under softer names than theft. For a brief moment, something hot moved through my chest. Not rage, not yet. Something sharper. Recognition. I sat on the edge of the bed with that paper in my hand and let that feeling pass all the way through me without interrupting it. Because interrupting it would have turned it into something messy. And I was no longer interested in messy. I understood Rochelle more clearly in that moment than I ever had at the airport. The ticket tearing had not been the beginning of her contempt. It had just been the first time she forgot to dress it properly. My daughter-in-law thought I was a soft old woman with a shoebox full of coupons. She was half right about the shoebox. That was the last time she would be right about anything. On the 5th day, I took the journal out of my dresser drawer and set it on the bed without opening it. That was as far as I got for almost an hour. I did not sit immediately. I stood there looking at it the way you look at something that has already decided your next move, whether you agree with it or not. The cover was worn at the corners from being handled in the dark, usually sometime after 2 in the morning, when grief becomes less dramatic and more practical. People talk about sorrow like it is all crying and collapse. They do not talk enough about the bookkeeping of it. The little places it goes when sleep will not hold you. The pages it fills, because saying certain things out loud would make them too real to survive before daylight. That journal had never been a weapon. It had been somewhere to put what I could not carry in my chest forever. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my hand over the cover once, then twice. Then I stopped, because I understood something clearly in that moment. If I opened it now, I was not opening it to remember. I was opening it to use. That was different. I thought about my husband's voice, not the strained one from the last months, the fuller one. The one that always dropped lower when he said my name, because he knew I moved through the world faster than my peace sometimes could. I thought about his laugh when something amused him more than he planned to show. I thought about the patience in him. Not softness, exactly. Steadiness. The kind of man who could make you feel less embarrassed just by staying in the room with your mistake. For a moment, I almost closed the drawer again. Not because I doubted what had been written, because I knew exactly who it would touch if I let it move. Marcellus. That was the part nobody prepares you for. Not the truth. The direction it travels once you release it. I sat there a little longer than I needed to, my hand still resting on the cover, and asked myself one question quietly. Am I ready for what happens after this leaves my hands? The answer did not come all at once. It settled, slowly, like something that had already been decided and was only waiting for me to catch up to it. When I finally opened the journal, the pages did not accuse anybody. That mattered to me. They mourned. One entry described the hospital smell the morning after the stroke. Another described the sound of his breathing once we got him home. Another said only, "He looked at me today like he knew I was trying not to break where he could see it." I read that one aloud to the empty room and had to stop for a minute after. Not because I was crying, because I remembered exactly how quiet that room had been. Then I turned to the entry with the timeline. My fingers paused at the edge of the page before I flipped it. That hesitation surprised me. Not fear, recognition. I did not read it aloud at first. I looked at the date, the ink, the pressure of my own handwriting, and remembered the woman I had been when I wrote it. Exhausted, frightened, careful, still trying to give everybody the benefit of whatever doubt I had left. That version of me had not known what would become of the months ahead. She had only known that some details felt too important to trust to memory alone. I traced one line with my finger. 47 minutes, written smaller than the rest, as if even then I had been trying not to disturb the truth by naming it too loudly. I closed the journal, not to stop, to steady myself. Then I picked up the phone and called Hollis. My husband's brother answered on the third ring with the kind of hello older men use when they are expecting either news or trouble, and have learned both can sound ordinary at first. We exchanged no pleasantries worth remembering. "I need to read you something," I said. There was a pause on his end. Not confusion. Adjustment. "Go ahead," he said. My voice stayed even. I was grateful for that. I read it the way it was written. No emphasis, no additions, no conclusions. Just the record. When I got to the part about the 47 minutes, Hollis said nothing. It was not a shocked silence. It was heavier than that. It sounded like a man sitting up straighter in a chair he had been leaning back in too long. Then he asked careful questions, not dramatic ones. What exactly had the doctors said? Had I written this at the time or later? Did anyone else hear the conversation with Marcellus the next morning? He did not ask what I believed. That mattered. I answered only what I knew, not what I suspected, not what had kept me awake. Facts, dates, phrases, the honest bones of it. At the end, I said, "I have carried this alone long enough, and I thought you deserved the record." There was a longer pause this time. Then Hollis breathed out through his nose. "You should have sent it sooner," he said quietly. Not accusing, but not excusing either. "I know," I told him. "I also know why I didn't." He did not argue with that. That was how I knew he understood more than he said. The next morning, I made a certified copy at a shipping store, sealed it in a large envelope, and mailed it with tracking. My hand did not shake when I handed it over. That surprised me. What surprised me more was what I felt after. Not relief, not guilt, release. I stood there watching the clerk stamp the receipt and understood that once the journal left my hands, the matter might take on a life I could not entirely guide. That was why I had waited 3 years. Because once truth leaves you, it no longer belongs only to you. That was also why I sent it now. Because some things grow heavier the longer you try to carry them alone. Some doors do not swing open. They give way slowly, like they have been holding weight for years. I had held that one shut out of love for my son. I opened it because some things are heavier than love. One of them is the truth. By the 6th day, I had stopped needing my pain explained back to me. That was the gift of the elder law consultation. Not comfort, language. There is a steadiness that comes over a woman when the thing she has been sensing in her bones is finally named in a room with diplomas on the wall and no family loyalty clouding the air. The attorney was a compact woman named Gail Mercer with rimless glasses and a voice that never rose above what was necessary. She listened longer than most people do. Then she began laying out terms in plain English: coercive dependency, financial pressure, informal displacement inside one's own home, boundary erosion that often appears before larger exploitation. None of it sounded dramatic when she said it. That was part of why it landed. Real harm rarely introduces itself with a spotlight. She was careful not to force my situation into a shape it had not fully reached. That mattered to me. I had no appetite for borrowed outrage. What I needed was clarity. Gail gave me that. Then she gave me something more useful than language. Order. What could be documented? What could be protected? What should be moved immediately? What should never again be discussed without paper? By the time I left her office, I was no longer asking myself whether I had the right to act. I was sequencing it. Not emotion first, structure first. By the time they boarded their return flight, my life would no longer be arranged in a way that allowed them to touch it. On the 7th day, I sat at my dining table with good paper, 2 envelopes, and the kind of quiet that belongs to schools after dismissal. The house was still without them, but it no longer felt empty. It felt paused. I wrote Marcellus first. That was the harder letter because love kept trying to interrupt the truth. I had to write past it, not against it. I told him what I had watched over the last 4 years, the silences, the excuses, the way he let one discourtesy pass, then another, until disrespect became the atmosphere in my own home and he had the nerve to breathe it like it was normal. I told him I knew weakness when I saw it because I had spent a lifetime trying to protect him from the cost of his. I told him I loved him enough to stop pretending his passivity was gentleness. It was not. It was surrender dressed in softer clothes. Then I wrote the line that cost me the most. I no longer confuse love with access. I sat with that sentence for a long moment after it was on the page. Not to soften it, to make sure it was clean. I did not beg him to leave his wife. I did not issue ultimatums people make when they still hope emotion will do the work. Structure should have done earlier. I told him I had made decisions to protect myself. I told him he would learn of them in order. I told him he was still my son. I did not tell him that meant things would stay the same. Motherhood had asked enough lies of me already. Rochelle's letter was shorter. That felt right. I named the airport plainly. I named the property plainly. I told her that any future communication regarding my house, my finances, or my person would go through counsel. No explanation, no argument, no tone for her to rearrange. Women like Rochelle know how to survive anger. They call it instability and carry on. What they struggle with is finality. So I gave her that. At the bottom, above my signature, I added one final line. I have already spoken to counsel. When I finished, I read both letters once and changed almost nothing. That surprised me. For years, I had adjusted my words to keep peace in rooms that were already against me. There was nothing left in me that needed editing now. I sealed the envelopes carefully, pressed each flap down with the side of my thumb, and set them beside my notebook. Then I did something I had not done before. I opened the notebook again, not to write feelings, to make a list. What would be placed on the table? What would be removed from the house? What would be documented before they walked back through that door? By the time I closed it, the plan was no longer forming. It was set. I sat there a long time looking at those envelopes. My name, still mine. My handwriting, still steady. My hand no longer shaken for anybody. A woman who has nothing left to protect can be reckless. I was not reckless. I had something left to protect. I had me. And by the time they came home, they were going to learn exactly what that meant. By the 9th day, the house had started feeling less like a place I lived in and more like a page I was correcting. Denise came by just after lunch in sensible shoes and a cream cardigan, carrying a legal pad and the kind of calm that does not ask foolish questions. She did not come to help me be brave. She came to help me be exact. That was better. We began in the den. I pulled open drawers, lifted framed pieces, and removed what was mine from the shared spaces, one item at a time. Not in anger, not in secrecy, methodically. Denise noted what she saw while I photographed each group before boxing it. Old family albums that had been moved from the bookshelf to a lower cabinet where nobody reached for them anymore. My silver serving tray from our 20th anniversary. The quilt my sister and I made for my husband the year he retired. Nothing dramatic on its own. That was the pattern Rochelle had always counted on. the slow reduction of a woman's presence until even she starts asking permission from rooms she paid for. At one point, I stood in the hallway looking at the wall where a large framed photograph from my husband's retirement dinner used to hang. He had been smiling in that picture with one hand resting lightly against my back, as if even then he understood that surviving a life together deserved better than performance. Rochelle had taken it down months earlier and replaced it with one of those glossy resort-style portraits. White clothes, stiff smiles, everybody posed like a brochure. I lifted that one off the nail and leaned it face in against the wall. Then I went to the closet, found my husband's photograph wrapped in tissue, and held it for a minute without hanging it back up. I left the wall empty. That absence said more than either picture could. By late afternoon, the house looked cleaner, but not colder. Truer, maybe. As if all I had really done was remove the parts that had been lying. After Denise left, I carried the last box into my bedroom and closed the door behind me. Then I went to the dining room and began arranging the table. That mattered to me more than I expected. I set everything down the way I used to prepare a lesson plan. Nothing wasted, everything in the order it needed to be understood. On top, I placed the travel reimbursement confirmation. Not a miracle refund. Not fantasy. Just documented recovery from travel protection, vendor reversals, and the unused portions of a trip that became easier to reclaim once my name, my payments, and my exclusion all sat together on paper. I wanted that page first because confusion slows arrogant people down. Let them wonder how I got my money back before they started realizing what else had already been taken out of their reach. Beneath that went the letters. Mine to Marcellus, mine to Rochelle. Under those, my attorney's card, Denise's summary, a copy of the updated will provisions. The first page of the trust instructions tied to the future sale proceeds of the house. I did not leave everything. Just enough. Enough for the first glance to do the work before the reading even began. Enough for them to understand, before they touched a single page, that the house was no longer a place they could settle into. It was something that had already been decided around them. Last, I placed one house key on top of my husband's old wooden paperweight. Walnut, heavy for its size, rubbed smooth at the edges by years of his hand. Not a threat, a statement. By the time I stepped back, the table did not look like paperwork. It looked like a conclusion. Anyone walking into that room would understand 3 things before they sat down. The money was no longer accessible. The house was no longer theirs to move inside. And whatever version of me they thought they could manage had already ended. I took one photograph of it with my phone. Not for memory. For record. Then I checked the locks, turned off the downstairs lights, picked up the overnight bag I had packed that morning, and stood in the foyer for a moment with my hand on the knob. The house behind me was spotless, quiet, final in a way I had not felt before. I did not wait around for their reaction, because the reaction was never the point. The arrangement was. I didn't need to be there when they walked in. A good lesson does not need the teacher standing in the room once the test begins. Rochelle did not come home and collapse. That would have made her easier to forgive. What she did instead was move fast. By the next morning, her version of events had already started making its rounds through the family in the careful voice women like her use when they want character assassination to sound like concern. I heard about it first from my sister, who came into the guest room holding her phone away from her face, like it smelled bad. "She says you're not yourself," she told me. I looked up from the chair by the window where I had been reading through a folder of property notes. "That was quick," my sister snorted. "She also says grief has been getting worse, and you embarrassed everybody with those papers." Everybody. That word told me Rochelle was still trying to hide behind a crowd. "What else?" I asked. My sister hesitated, just long enough to matter. "She's been asking people if you've been forgetting things," she said. "Little things, conversations, dates." I held her gaze. "And?" I asked. "And she says she's worried you might be making decisions you don't fully understand." There it was. Not anger, not defense, disqualification. I leaned back slightly in the chair. "That explains the speed," I said. Because that was not gossip. That was positioning. Over the next 2 days, pieces of her story came back to me through cousins, churchwomen, and one old family friend who called not to gossip, but to listen carefully for what I chose not to deny. Rochelle said I had become confused, said I was acting out because widowhood had finally caught up with me. Said the papers on the dining table were dramatic nonsense put together by a lonely older woman who had started believing the worst about everybody. She said people were misunderstanding what happened at the airport. That phrase traveled too. Misunderstanding. But her version had cracks in it from the beginning. Too many people knew I had paid for the trip. Too many people knew I had covered the tickets, the resort, and the extras, because Rochelle herself had bragged about it beforehand, in that sugary way people brag when they want generosity to make them look chosen. And once that fact sat next to the question nobody could stop asking, then why was she left at the gate? The whole pretty thing began to split at the seams. Rochelle was good in living rooms. Good in circles where people want to keep peace badly enough to confuse it with truth. She knew how to tilt her head at the right moment, how to lower her voice, how to make cruelty sound like stress. What she did not know how to handle was a situation where the paper had already arrived before the performance. So she escalated. She called a lawyer. That detail got back to me too, not from her, but from the same cousin who always heard things 2 hours before everybody else. Rochelle had gone in expecting quick reassurance and came out with less confidence than she brought. The deed was clear. The house was mine. The living arrangement had been informal and permissive, not protective. There was no co-ownership to argue, no secret leverage hidden in sentiment, no legal fog thick enough to build a home inside. For a brief moment, I imagined the look on her face when she realized that. Not shock. Correction. After that, she turned sharper. The calls started first, then the texts, then 2 voicemails from numbers I did not know, but recognized anyway by the breathing before the speaking. One message called me unfair. Another called me prideful. One of them said, "Mama, let's not do this through outsiders," which was rich coming from a woman who had tried to turn my own family into a courtroom of whispers. Then came the message she did not expect me to hear. She said, "If you keep pushing this," my sister added that evening, standing in the doorway, "she might have to look into whether you're being properly advised." I looked up slowly, meaning capacity, meaning competence, meaning she was willing to suggest, out loud, that I might not be fit to make my own decisions. I nodded once. "Of course she is," I said, because that was the next move for someone like Rochelle. If you cannot control the outcome, question the authority of the person making it. Marcellus called too, but only once. He left no message. That told me more than words would have. Then Rochelle showed up at my sister's house. My sister saw her first through the front curtain and said, "That woman has a lot of nerve dressing for innocence in beige." I stayed in the back bedroom and did not move, not out of fear, out of discipline. Rochelle knocked twice, then harder the 3rd time. My sister opened the door just enough to remind her she was not welcome and listened while Rochelle tried on 3 different tones in under 2 minutes. Injured, offended, reasonable. When none of them worked, she asked to speak to me woman to woman. My sister told her, "You should have tried that at the airport." There was a pause after that. then footsteps, then silence. The only direct response Rochelle got from me came on my attorney's letterhead that afternoon. 1 page. Clean language. All future contact regarding my person, property, finances, or occupancy matters was to go through counsel. Nothing emotional. Nothing she could drag into a side argument and survive. Nothing she could soften. That was the part she was least prepared for. She was used to winning arguments by exhausting people. She had never dealt with a woman who had already finished speaking in a lawyer's office. The news did not spread through the family like gossip. It moved slower than that, heavier. By the time it reached Marcellus, it had already passed through enough hands to lose drama and gain weight. Hollis had made a formal inquiry connected to my husband's stroke timeline. That was the language people used when they repeated it back. Formal inquiry. Not accusation. Not scandal. Just a quiet phrase sturdy enough to unsettle anybody who had been depending on vagueness to survive. It might take months. It might go nowhere criminally. It might change nothing anybody could point to on paper. But it existed. That was enough. I heard later that Marcellus got the call while sitting at the dining table, the same one where I had once taught him long division and later left him the truth in layers he could no longer step around. I do not know whether he had already read both letters by then, or only mine. I do know he had fielded questions from relatives first. Not the loud kind, the worse kind. Careful questions, quiet ones. The kind that force a man to hear his own answers while they are still leaving his mouth. Rochelle's version of events had stopped controlling the room. That was new for him. Men like my son do not break when the world yells. They break when the excuses they have been living inside stop sounding reasonable even to themselves. I imagine he sat there with my handwriting in front of him, Hollis's name now tied to something official, and that old protected place inside him beginning to cave in. Not because he was suddenly brave, because he was finally cornered by clarity. He called me that evening. I looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. My sister was in the kitchen running dishwater. The apartment smelled faintly of onions and clean towels. Ordinary things. I think that helped me. "Hello," I said. For a second, he did not speak. Then, "Ma." His voice sounded thinner than I had ever heard it. Not childlike, stripped. I did not rescue him from that. "What do you need, Marcellus?" Another silence. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the effort it was taking him not to let the call turn into the same shape his life always took when pressure came. Explanation first, accountability later, if at all. "I got a call from Uncle Hollis," he said. "I assumed you might." He exhaled hard. "Why would you do that? There are questions people ask when they want information. Then there are questions people ask when they already know the answer and just want somebody else to carry it for them. I had spent enough years as a teacher to know the difference. So I did not answer the question he asked. I answered the one underneath it. "I kept records," I said. "I shared them with your father's brother. He deserved the truth I had." He started to say something, then stopped. I could almost hear Rochelle's language fraying in his mouth before it reached me. Grief, confusion, misunderstanding, stress. All those little borrowed words had probably served him well until now. But some moments will not let a man speak rented excuses. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It wasn't like that. I looked out the window at the parking lot below, where somebody was loading groceries into a trunk with slow, tired movements. Life going on. Always going on. "I did not say it was," I told him. That left him nowhere comfortable to stand. He made one more attempt. "We didn't know at first. It all happened fast." Maybe he believed that. Maybe parts of him still needed to. But I was no longer willing to help him build a home inside his own evasions. So I asked the only question that mattered. If it had been me on that floor, I said, how long would you have waited? The line went still. Not dead, just still. And in that stillness, I heard everything I needed to hear. Not because silence proves guilt. It does not. Silence proves something else sometimes. Recognition. Character meeting itself without enough time to arrange its face. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not punish him with words. Good night, Marcellus, I said softly and hung up. I asked him one question. If it had been me on that floor, how long would you have waited? He said nothing. That was the loudest answer he had given me in years. I met the real estate agent on a Thursday morning with a folder under my arm and no sentiment left in my posture. Her name was Paula Dent. Mid-50s, flat shoes, sharp eyes, no wasted language. She had sold houses through divorces, deaths, relocations, and one situation she only described as 3 sisters with 1 dead mother and too many opinions. I liked her immediately. Not because she was warm, because she was exact. We sat at a small round table in her office while she reviewed the paperwork my attorney had already helped prepare. The house was solely mine and always had been. That mattered. Marcellus and Rochelle had lived there by permission, not by ownership, not by lease, not by any arrangement that could be dressed up later into something stronger than it was. Paula did not dramatize any of it. She simply nodded and said, "Good. Then we do this cleanly." Cleanly. I had come to appreciate that word. There would be no foolishness, no changing locks in the night, no raised voices on porches. My attorney would handle formal written notice and timing. Paula would handle the listing, the showings, the photographs, and the offer process. My job was to decide what price represented release, without turning the sale into a tantrum with paperwork. That afternoon, we walked the house together. The photographer came later, but Paula wanted one full pass first. I followed her from room to room with my hands clasped loosely in front of me while she noted sight lines, light, repairs that no longer mattered, and little cosmetic details. Buyers always pretend they care about more than they do. I watched the house through her eyes and my own at the same time. The difference between those 2 ways of seeing nearly undid me once in the hallway, but only once. The den looked smaller without my husband's things anchoring it. The guest room looked more honest now that the decorative clutter had been reduced. In the kitchen, the morning light still fell across the counter by the sink in the exact same slant it had 20 years ago when I stood there packing school lunches and signing field trip slips. Nothing in the room apologized for what had happened. Houses do not do that. They simply hold the shape of whatever has been lived inside them. I did not cry. That surprised me less than it might have a month earlier. What I felt moving through those rooms was not grief, exactly. It was measurement. The distance between the woman who had once believed love could keep a home safe and the woman standing there now pricing her own release. The distance between endurance and clarity, between shelter and entitlement, between what I built and what they assumed. When Paula asked about the number, I gave her one. Fair, not soft, not spiteful. I was not trying to punish anybody through square footage. Revenge inflates. Release prices accurately. The listing went live 2 days later. The photographs were beautiful in a clean, impersonal way that almost amused me. Buyers do not see your life. They see possibility. Sunny breakfast nook, spacious primary bedroom, mature trees, updated bath, good school district. No mention of betrayal in the entryway or disrespect settling into the baseboards over time. Just light, angle, and market language. Maybe that is mercy. The offer came in within 3 weeks from a couple relocating for work. Strong financing, reasonable contingencies. They wanted possession on a timeline. My attorney said we could support cleanly with formal notice already in motion. I accepted before lunch. The attorney sent the lawful vacate notice that same day. News of Rochelle's reaction reached me in pieces, the way most useful news does. Outrage first, then bargaining, then disbelief. I heard she called the notice cruel. I heard she said family does not do this to family. I heard she asked whether there was still time to talk. The part that mattered most was quieter than all of that. Marcellus did not contest the sale. He did not fight the listing, did not challenge the ownership, did not try to delay what he already knew was coming. Sometimes a man's deepest admission is not in what he says. It is in what he no longer attempts to defend. The house sold in 22 days. It took me 22 years to make a life inside it. I thought that was fair. Rochelle asked for the meeting 3 times before I agreed to it once. The first request came through Marcellus in a message so carefully worded it felt ghost-written by guilt. The second came through her attorney, dressed in phrases like productive conversation and family resolution. The third arrived the same way the serious things always had by then, on letterhead, with dates attached and no room left for pretending this was still a misunderstanding that could be softened over dinner. I agreed to one meeting only. My attorney's office. Mid-morning. All proper parties present. That part mattered to me more than the meeting itself. I was done entering rooms where Rochelle could rearrange tone fast enough to make the truth look rude. I wanted fluorescent lights, legal pads, a closed door, and witnesses who billed by the hour. She was already seated when I arrived. That caught my eye first. Rochelle had always liked the power of appearing composed before other people settled into themselves. She wore a cream blouse, small gold hoops, and the kind of makeup meant to suggest effort without admitting to it. At a glance, she looked put together. At a second glance, she looked held together. There is a difference. The skin around her mouth had gone tight. Her posture was still elegant, but not relaxed. Even her handbag was set on the floor beside her chair with more force than grace. Marcellus sat to one side, quiet enough to almost disappear into his own jacket. He did not look at me when I walked in. I noticed that and gave it back to him by not pausing over it. I took my seat, set my gloves beside my purse, and folded my hands in my lap. Rochelle began before anyone invited her to. She spoke about family first. That was predictable. Then misunderstanding. Then stress. Then the trip, described in the kind of language people use when they want a public humiliation, to sound like a scheduling problem that got emotional. She said everyone had been under pressure. She said things had escalated unnecessarily. She said there had been pain on all sides. That phrase nearly made me smile. Pain on all sides. As if the tearing of my ticket at the gate had been some weather event that happened to all of us equally. Then she brought grace into it. That was her reach, not faith. Performance wearing faith's perfume. She said families should be allowed to find their way back from mistakes. She said the house sale did not need to become permanent harm. She said future grandchildren should not suffer for present tension. She said everyone deserved the chance to move forward without documents turning private hurt into structural punishment. I let her finish. That was the strongest thing I did in the room. Because silence, when used correctly, forces people to keep walking until they step fully into what they were trying to hide. When Rochelle stopped, my attorney did not argue. He did not lecture. He simply opened a folder and slid a document across the polished table toward her counsel. Trust paperwork. Not all of it. Just enough. enough to show that the house sale proceeds were already secured inside an attorney-managed structure. Enough to show there was no deed left to discuss, no loose account to circle, no vulnerable widow sitting on liquid sentiment waiting to be persuaded by the right tears. The funds were protected, directed, and closed to casual reach, not frozen in bitterness, structured with intention. That distinction sat in the room whether Rochelle could bear it or not. For the first time since I had known her, she had no immediate language. She looked at the page, then at her attorney, then back at the page again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something softer if she gave them enough disappointment. Marcellus still said nothing. His silence no longer felt evasive. It felt late. There was nothing left to negotiate. That was the real climax. Not shouting, not confession. Absence. Every opening Rochelle thought she could still press had already been sealed before she entered the room. She had mistaken access for entitlement so long she had stopped recognizing the difference. I stood, buttoned my coat, and picked up my purse. Then I looked at her. Not long. Just long enough. And I said, calmly, "This door's closed." No emphasis, no explanation, no second sentence to soften it. Just truth, placed where it could not be moved. I turned, walked to the door, and left them sitting there with paperwork they could not argue and a sentence they could not undo. Some lessons do not require volume, only finality. By the time winter began thinning out around the edges, the noise had mostly burned off the situation, and what remained was consequence. Not the loud kind people like to imagine. No courtroom surprise, no dramatic confession in a parking lot, no late apology powerful enough to reverse what had already shown itself. Just consequence in its true form, slow, administrative, personal, and impossible to charm once it has settled into place. Marcellus and Rochelle were renting by then. I know that because news travels in families whether invited or not, and because my sister has a way of hearing things without going looking for them. 2 bedrooms. Decent area. Smaller than the house they had grown used to moving through like it belonged to their future, but it was not the size that reached me. It was the adjustment. My sister mentioned one detail without meaning to. "They argued in the parking lot the first week," she said one afternoon, setting her phone down like the story had weight on it. "About boxes." I looked at her. "Boxes?" I asked. She nodded. "Which ones mattered enough to bring up? Which ones didn't?" I said nothing. But I understood, because that is how things begin to show. Not in declarations, in decisions nobody thought would ever need discussing. What stays, what goes, what suddenly has to be measured. Their marriage, from what little I heard and less I pursued, had grown strained under the kind of pressure no outsider has to create. Once comfort is removed, people have to meet each other more honestly. Not better, just more honestly. Weak things do not always break with noise. Sometimes they sag in plain sight. Sometimes they keep standing and become harder to look at. Either way, the truth of their structure had started showing. Hollis's inquiry was still pending. That did not surprise me. Systems move at the pace. Systems move, especially when grief is old enough for offices to treat it like paperwork instead of urgency. There had been no miracle development, no sudden call promising justice with a stamp on it. Just acknowledgement, review, waiting. Slow and unresolved. That, too, felt honest. I had long since stopped expecting institutions to carry the emotional weight of what families fail to do. The inquiry existed. That mattered. It meant the night of my husband's stroke had not disappeared just because the people inside, it preferred vagueness. The community did not change its mind about Rochelle all at once. That would have been too easy. It shifted the way things usually do, One conversation at a time, one raised eyebrow, one quiet reconsideration that never quite turns into a public statement. Nobody stood up in church and denounced her. Nobody needed to. Once the airport story began circulating next to everything else, people started revisiting old moments with new eyes. The too sweet tone. The way she answered questions directed at Marcellus. The way she had slowly taken over rooms without ever seeming to ask permission. Not everyone said something, but fewer people defended her. And that was enough. None of it required my help. I did not gossip. I did not explain. A woman can waste a lot of dignity trying to manage how other people finally notice what was always there. As for me, I moved into a smaller apartment on the east side with a kitchen window that catches morning light and a park close enough to hear children on Saturdays if I cracked the glass. The first week there, I kept waiting for the space to feel temporary. It never did. It felt chosen. That was different. The first night, I placed my husband's paperweight on the shelf beside my books and stood there a moment longer than necessary, not because I was unsure where it belonged, but because I realized something quietly. Nothing in that room had been moved without my permission. That had not been true for a long time. I bought one new chair for the reading corner. I signed up to teach weekend literacy classes at church again, mostly because I missed the order of helping somebody understand something that had frightened them 5 minutes earlier. There is grace in that work. Also, honesty. Children do not pretend confusion is kindness. They either know or they do not. And when they learn, the whole room shifts. I have started writing again too. Not the journal this time. Not grief written down so it won't poison sleep. Something else. Small pieces, observations, memory without panic attached to it. I do not yet know what it will become. I only know it is no longer being written to survive the night. And I sleep. Not every night, perfectly, but enough. That may sound like a small ending to some people. It is not. To sleep all the way through until morning in a body that has carried watchfulness for years is no minor victory. It is a return, not to innocence. I am too old for that, but to steadiness. People ask whether I won. I tell them winning was never the point. The point was making sure I could never be erased again. That part worked. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning with the electric bill, a grocery circular, and a church newsletter I would normally read first. I knew Marcellus's handwriting before I turned the envelope over. That stopped me longer than the name itself. These days, people apologize by text because text lets them stay half inside the room and half outside it. A message can be sent quickly, revised mentally after the fact, blamed on bad wording if it lands wrong. Handwriting is different. Handwriting asks a person to sit still with what they mean long enough for their own hand to form it. That mattered to me before I ever opened the envelope. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and slit the top carefully with the butter knife I keep by the sugar bowl. The window over the sink was full of soft morning light. Somewhere down in the park, a dog barked twice, then stopped. Ordinary sounds, good sounds. I took the first page out and unfolded it slowly. He had written more than I expected. Not pages and pages. Not the kind of performance men mistake for honesty when guilt first loosens their throat. Just enough. Enough to sound like he had finally run out of places to hide inside himself. I will not tell you all that letter said. Some things belong to the people who finally tell the truth, even if late. But I will tell you this. He named one failure I never thought he would put into words. He did not circle it, did not soften it, did not blame stress, confusion, his marriage, the timing, the pressure, the way things escalated, or any of the other little blankets weak people pull over their conscience when they are cold with themselves. He named it plainly. And because he named it plainly, I knew something in him had shifted. Not finished, not healed, but shifted. He had begun, at last, to tell himself the truth. My coffee went cool while I sat there holding those pages. I did not call him. Apology is not a key that turns a lock the moment it arrives. Readiness cannot be forced just because regret finally learned how to write neatly. I folded the letter back along its original creases, slid it into the envelope, and placed it beside the sugar bowl. Then I washed my cup, changed my clothes, and drove to the cemetery. It was the first time I had gone there without dread tightening across my ribs before I parked. The grass had been cut recently. The stone looked smaller than grief had made it in my mind. I stood there for a moment with my purse hanging from one arm and my car keys resting in my palm. And when I began speaking, my voice came out steady. I told my husband what happened, not every detail. He knew me well enough in life not to need embroidery in death. I told him I protected what we built. I told him the house had been sold cleanly. I told him the money had been placed where greed could not put its hands on it. I told him Hollis knew the record now. I told him Marcellus had finally written something that sounded like the beginning of a man meeting himself honestly. Then I told him something I had not fully said even to myself until then. I hoped he would understand the difference between vengeance and refusal, because that was what this had been in the end. Not revenge in the loud, wasteful way people like to name women once they stop swallowing insult politely. Refusal. Refusal to be displaced. Refusal to be managed. Refusal to leave my life in the hands of people who mistook my softness for surrender. When I walked back to my car, the morning light had sharpened a little. I got in, started the engine, and sat with both hands on the wheel, not wondering what was left of my life, but understanding, for the first time in a long time, that what was left was mine. I was 64 years old when my daughter-in-law tore up a plane ticket I paid for, and my son let her do it. I thought that was the moment they humiliated me. I know now it was the moment they returned me to myself. Somewhere between that airport parking lot and a quiet cemetery on a Tuesday morning, I remembered who I was before I became somebody's mother, somebody's wife, somebody's burden to manage. I remembered her, and I decided she deserved the rest of the journey.